This is a book of lies. This is a book of sorrow. This is the story of half a life. This is a book of pain. This is not a book about Hollywood, and it's not the full, true story of Frances Farmer. Frances did not write this book, but she did try. Frances Farmer was an acclaimed stage actress who spent several years in Hollywood attempting a successful film career, only to crash and burn in the most shocking way. For her troubles, Frances was incarcerated in mental health facilities for 8 years, subjected to brutal and soul-numbing conditions, and finally released only to spend the next 2 decades of her life in a downward spiral of alcohol addiction, shame, and eventually death. This book is about all that, but it's not exactly the truth. It makes, however, for a salacious story and the subject of at least 2 biopics. This book still has people wondering, was she crazy? Was Frances Farmer mentally ill? Was she really the most difficult woman in Hollywood? Was she lobotomized, as has been rumored? How much of this tale is real? For even in death, Frances's story is full of lies and half-truths. Her book begins with these words, but did Frances pen them? For 8 years, I was an inmate in a state asylum for the insane. During those years, I passed through such unbearable terror that I deteriorated into a wild, frightened creature, intent only on survival. And I survived. I was raped by orderlies, gnawed on by rats, and poisoned by tainted food. And I survived. I was chained in padded cells, strapped into straitjackets, and half drowned in ice baths. And I survived. The asylum itself was a steel trap, and I was not released from its jaws alive and victorious. I crawled out mutilated, whimpering, and terribly alone. But I did survive. There is the story of Frances Farmer found here in the pages of Will There Be a Morning, and in the Hollywood renditions of her life. There is the story told in tabloid fashion of lobotomies, assaults, drunken mayhem, and sheer madness. There is the myth of Mad Frances Farmer, our favorite patient, who will come back as fire to burn all the liars, leave a blanket of ash on the ground. And there is the truth. This is the story of the search for the truth, the way through the madness of Frances Farmer's tale, and the hope that she will take, not her revenge, but her legacy and life story back from all who would use it to spread misinformation for no other reason than entertainment. Frances Farmer is not your entertainment. Frances was a human being, treated to inhumanity both during her life and in the years since her death. She was more than your madness muse. She was a survivor. Frances Elena Farmer was born September 19, 1913 in Seattle, Washington. Her father, Ernest, was an attorney, and her mother, Lillian, a self-proclaimed dietitian and nutritionist. Frances was the youngest child, with half-siblings from both her mother and father. Her parents separated when Frances was just 4 years old, and she and her mother relocated to Chico, California, before a concerned aunt saw that Lillian was not fit to be raising children and sent Frances and an older sibling back to their father's care. Frances remained with her father, but a year later Lillian returned, and although she and Ernest did not reconcile, the two remained together at home with the children for a time. At the age of 17, while a senior in high school, Frances won a contest from the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. She entered her essay entitled God Dies and won $100. The essay was based upon the stark understanding that sometimes, when we pray to God for small things, our prayers are answered. In her case, a beloved hat that went missing was found. Yet for the big things, the most urgent prayers, a classmate who lost both parents in an accident, for instance, God was nowhere to be found. In her essay, Frances wrote, "I began to figure out that if God loved all his children equally, why did he bother about my hat and let other people lose their fathers and mothers for always? I began to see that he didn't have much to do about people's dying or hats or anything. They happened whether he wanted them to or not, and he stayed in heaven and pretended not to notice. I wondered a little why God was such a useless thing. It seemed a waste of time to have him. After that, he became less and less until he was nothingness. I felt rather proud to think that I had found the truth by myself without help from anyone. It puzzled me that other people had not found out too. God was gone." Yet at the end of this book, Frances turns to God in solace during her terminal illness. It is one of many examples in this book, allegedly written by Farmer herself, that contradicts itself. Perhaps Frances evolved from a doubting teen, questioning whether a God that had once existed simply stopped caring, to a woman who at the end of her life would turn to God. People do change. But did Frances Farmer, or did someone else craft a life story that would be peddled out for decades as hers? Yet that 1931 essay put young Frances into a harsh spotlight in her hometown. Seattle society condemned the piece and denounced Little Miss Farmer as a rabble-rouser. Frances didn't care. She went from a bright, precocious teen to a young woman in the next few years, becoming a talented young actor at the University of Washington. She won another award, this one associated with a radical Seattle newspaper associated with communism, which Frances saw as aligned with the Stanislavski Method School of Acting, which she studied. Frances won a trip to Russia, which put her again into the crosshairs of the conservative Seattle Post newspaper and high society in the Emerald City, and also her own mama. But Frances had an ulterior motive to her acting journey, not to Mother Russia, but to the return destination of Manhattan, where she hoped to embark upon a serious stage career. She was successful, at least in attracting the attention of a talent agent, who signed 22-year-old Frances to a contract. It was at an inopportune time, however, the agent explained. Broadway was not casting during the summer season. Instead, he recommended that Frances take a screen test, just in case. Why not get some minor work in films while waiting for the Great White Way to open up again? Thus began the 7-year ordeal, as Farmer would explain, of trying to be taken seriously as a thespian while reduced to work churning out Hollywood duds. Granted, her duds co-starred Cary Grant and Bing Crosby, work that any other ingenue would have given her eye teeth for. However, Frances, with her husky voice and bold Nordic features, would never pass as an ingenue. And the roles the studios gave her, though penned by talented screenwriters and starring dashing leading men, were not star makers for the actress. So Frances, at her first chance, went dashing back to the stage, a coveted role in Golden Boy by Clifford Odets, the story of a young boxer. Frances was cast in the leading lady role in a Broadway production and quickly began a torrid love affair with the writer. But Odets was married to Academy Award-winning actress Louise Rainier, and Frances was soon scuttled, both off the stage and out from Odets' bed sheets. Disgraced, she was ordered to return to Hollywood. She actually had a husband by that point, the young man who rechristened himself Leif Erikson, but it's clear theirs was a Hollywood concoction and not a match made in love. Frances returned to Erikson, to California, to filmmaking, and it all began to spectacularly fall apart. Parties where she was drunk as a skunk, apartments trashed, a contentious divorce, an arrest for driving with her headlights on during World War II's blackout restrictions on the West Coast, and more. The big downfall came with an arrest after an incident on set in which she slapped a crew member with a hairbrush. The next day, at the Knickerbocker Hotel, Frances was arrested for assault. She was nude, drunk, and passed out when police arrived. She went from sobbing and terrified, crying out, "Have you ever had a broken heart?" to defiant, destructive, and derisive. At her booking, when asked her profession, Frances responded, "Cocksucker." The studio sent her to a sanitarium to dry out and clear her head, but in some twisted chance of fate, as Frances failed to do either, dear old Mother Lillian was appointed her legal guardian, who decided that Frances needed serious therapy. Off to Bedlam. In Will There Be a Morning, Frances, allegedly, writes of her arrival at Washington's Western State Hospital and her descent into utter madness. On May 22, 1945, at 3:24 in the afternoon, I was delivered bound and gagged to the state asylum like a dog gone mad. They carried me to a small admitting ward, and despite my thrashing, 3 orderlies finally succeeded in strapping me into an armless wooden chair that was bolted to the floor. I tried to fight myself free, but belts were strapped across my chest and lap, and my ankles were tied to the legs of the chair. The straitjacket was still on me, but mercifully they pulled the gag from my mouth. The room, lighted only by a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, was growing dark. I managed to quiet myself by staring at the raw light. Then, for want of a better thing to do, I began to concentrate on localizing the pain that racked my body. My mother had sent me into this hell, my own personal Judas, and the thought of it drowned me in hatred. I would nurture this passion. I would live on it, feed on it, keep it alive. I was trapped and filled with fear, but I knew that as long as I could focus my hatred on those who had been merciless in their drive to defeat me, an arrogant courage would provide me with the determination to stay alive. For the next 7+ years, Frances was subjected to this kind of treatment and worse. Will There Be a Morning does not hold back on the conditions she witnessed in the asylum or was subjected to. But it does not mention a lobotomy. That's a rumor that sprung up years later, alleged by a writer of another discredited biography published in 1978. So was Frances insane or just troublesome? Or a combination of the two with a heavy dose of alcoholism? Hard to say. She was diagnosed in the mid-1940s with paranoid schizophrenia, but that too could be attributed to heavy drinking, which can cloud one's judgment and cause delusions. Farmer would continue to battle her addictions for the rest of her life, including once she was finally released from the asylum. Her release was tainted in deception as well. In the early 50s, Frances was paroled from Western State Hospital to her mother's care and returned to the home shared by Ernest and Lillian. Frances was under the impression that the hospital would demand she return if she misbehaved, and so for the next 2 years she was a dutiful daughter, caring for her elderly parents and fearing, always fearing, that the men in white suits would again come for her if she stepped out of line. Frances did not know she had been paroled and was free. It was 2 years before she discovered this and requested that her mother's conservatorship be lifted. She took a job as a laundry sorter at the Olympic Hotel in Seattle and met and married a city utility worker. When her mother took ill, the couple moved in with the aging Lillian, and after dear old Mum was sent to a nursing home in 1957, the couple separated. Frances then moved to Eureka, California, and worked as a bookkeeper for a photographer. It was there that she met her third husband, Leland Mikesell, a broadcast promoter from Indianapolis. It was Mikesell who convinced fragile Frances that she was due for a Hollywood comeback. First, she had 2 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, followed by a notable guest spot on the television program This Is Your Life. On that program, she won an Edsel Ford and had to dodge dicey questions about her mental health, her sobriety, her sexuality, and more. This Is Your Life did gain Frances the opportunity to return to stage work, and she was hired for a series of summer stock productions across the Midwest. From there, she landed a coveted spot hosting her own daytime movie hosting gig for the NBC affiliate in Indianapolis. She and Mike Sell divorced, but soon Frances had met someone new. Her name was Janira Ratcliffe, a widow from Virginia. And though for years Frances denied rumors of a romantic relationship between herself and Jean, it is clear that something more serious than a casual friendship was going on between the 2 women. For it was Jean and her family who bailed Frances out time and time again over the next decade as she lost gigs, got blackout drunk, destroyed relationships, lived in virtual impoverishment, got second chances, blew every one of them, tried writing poetry, started a small business, and eventually wound up living with Jean and a dozen or so cats. By the late 1960s, Frances was the actress in residence at Purdue University, had quit drinking entirely, and was convinced by Jean and friends to write her autobiography. This is also when she apparently found God, became a Roman Catholic, and then quit her acting career. She accepted an advance on her story after recording a series of cassette tapes about her life. The advance was intended to sustain her financially while she used those recordings to write her full life history. But in 1970, Frances was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, likely caused by her lifetime of smoking. She was sent home from the hospital, and just 3 weeks later, died on August 1st, 1970. This book was not written at the time of Frances's death. So who wrote it? Likely Jean Ratcliffe, her life partner. Why do we know Frances could not have written this story? Not just because the timing is off. Not because of what was included, the salacious stories from the mental hospital that seem written to make headlines, or the sad tales of her later booze binges, but more importantly, what was omitted. There is virtually nothing in this book about acting, about Frances's acting, or her studies, or what it was like on set, or what the various people she knew and worked with were like. We learn nothing about the craft of an actor, about her daily life, about the studio system. Instead, we get glowing and grateful passages about Janira's family, her warm, wonderful, gracious, generous Southern family. It's clear that what happened is that Frances and Jean had both a personal and a financial relationship, and when Frances blew her publishing advance and, with her sudden death, no book was forthcoming, someone had to write it for her. Frances's estate would have been sued without it. So Jean took those cassette tapes and perhaps a few stingy details that Frances shared with her over the years and churned out Will There Be a Morning. Jean also co-wrote other books after Frances's death. Is there truth within these pages? Sure there is. Are there lies? Maybe, maybe not. But is the whole story of Frances Farmer to be found here? Definitely not. We get Frances's words and thoughts, but someone else's narrative, which does a grave disservice to the legacy of a brilliant but broken woman, an actor who merits a serious study, a tale of psychiatric malfeasance that surely should be known and discredited, and a life split in two, before the asylum and after, on stage and screen and in real life, imagined and oh so very true. And perhaps some of the depictions of her life in the asylum have been exaggerated. After all, that book advance had to result with a story that would sell copies. Who exactly was Frances Farmer? We can only turn to these words which may have been hers, and quite simply may not have been.
It is hard to think. I would keep my senses, for I fear oblivion, and I am carried back to the years of shock and the nightmare comes again to haunt me. But this time it haunts with a reason and tells me that I have faced more of death than at this threshold on which I now stand. I have died by the hour, by rote almost. For years I died, every day. Every hour, every movement of the clock was a death, and knowing it, I can face the strangulation with ease. I know the terror of pain as it is now, but locked away those years, forgotten in a madhouse, I suffered even more. I have God here, but He was never there.
Frances Elena Farmer was more than your madness muse. She deserves the truth and her rightful place, not as the most difficult woman in Hollywood, but certainly one of the more talented if troubled. Being troubled is certainly not a new symptom among the acting community. And let's hope that the lies and misinformation, including the false rumor that Frances was lobotomized, are finally laid to rest. I would encourage you to watch her films. While they are not the chosen career as a stage actress that Frances desired, they do showcase her many talents. And that, ultimately, is what she should be known for.